All right, so this is just going to be a fun discussion. We're going to take a break here from the game lessons, and we're just going to talk about Ghostbusters. We're gonna rant a little bit. I'm going to rant a little bit, uh, and I guess this is going to be a discussion about world building and kind of the cosmology and the implications, and kind of exploring some of the untread ground of Ghostbusters, because to me it's just such a fascinating setting, and there's a whole lot of really cool things that you don't, and like, to me, one of the great things about Ghostbusters is you don't have to go far to find things to analyze. Basically, everything you need is in the basic canon, um, with the exception here of the chart from the Ghostbusters role playing game, common ghostly terminology, which explains the different ghost classifications. And because the real Ghostbusters cartoon, which is really good, um, isn't or is sort of obviously its own canon. I don't want to say it's not canon, because it's not like it doesn't matter. It's just that for the purposes of Ghostbusters lore, it is separate. It's interesting enough to be its own thing. So if you haven't seen the real Ghostbusters cartoon, check it out. But the main Ghostbusters canon, just being one, two, Afterlife, and Frozen Empire, has so much to look at, and really, like, there's just so much cool stuff. Um, I think after years of thinking about it, and years of, just kind of like musing about these things, I think probably the best way to look at it is that Ghostbusters kind of seems like it plays by Warhammer 40,000 chaos rules a little bit. Um, there doesn't seem to be, or so for a number of reasons. One is because there seems to be almost no indication, or maybe so it's a combination of like Dungeons and Dragons and Warhammer 40,000, uh, like chaos rules, because there doesn't seem to be separate realms necessarily. Um, Sort of like in the Immaterium in Warhammer 40K, um, there are different regions. Like, there's, Nurgle's Garden, there's uh whatever, the sorcerer worlds of Zinch, and all the other different areas, and um there's like planets that specifically can, they're manifested in the warp, and it's got its own constantly changing terrain, and whatnot. But it's all still part of the same cosmology, whereas in other fictional settings, um, there are distinct realms that can be disconnected from one another. Like, you can't get from Zinch's realm to Nurgle's realm in those settings. Like, if they existed in somewhere else, it wouldn't just be the warp. The warp wouldn't exist. It would be the separate realms. Like, there would be Hades, and then there would be uh like the Stygian abyss. There would be um Helheim. There would be, like, different, like, separate realms for, like, let's, because we're talking about the afterlife, separate afterlife realms, or maybe like, it's probably a bad example, like maybe in D&D, like different god controlled realms. And this is relevant here in Ghostbusters, because we obviously see that Gozer appears in its whatever own realm, It's got sort of like a pocket dimension temple. Most of it appears to be a foggy void, but clearly structures can exist because we see this floating temple, and Gozer definitely has powers of creation, and I would assume in her own realm she can has free powers of creation, but it's not explicit that it's her own realm. It's not explicit that it's necessarily like Gozer's realm. That temple appears floating in a void. And so it's interesting to kind of speculate, um, because there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of connection in the same way that we see in Dungeons and Dragons between gods and their own, pocket realms, and the interactions they have with either the material plane or somewhere else, or whether it's connected to like an elemental plane, or you know however it fits into the cosmology. um, there's different levels of connection and dependence that don't seem to be present in Ghostbusters. There, there doesn't seem to be a necessary need of worship. There's not a need for souls. Um, there doesn't seem to be like there's no paladins. There's no warlocks. There's no, it's very, it's very alien. And to me, that screams 40K, that screams chaos, that screams the immaterium. And then there's a number of other interesting things that pop up. And I guess in terms of canon, I'm going to put Ghostbusters Afterlife a little lower than 1, 2, and Frozen Empire. Um, there's there's really only one thing that I would bother wondering about. Well, actually, maybe so two scenes. One is the scene where Gozer comes back, and although it's sort of like a Member Berries line where she's like, "Are you a god?" Like, yeah, she's repeating what we got in the first movie. Thanks, but it turns out may not be a throwaway line. And then also the presence of Egon's ghost, which is one of the most interesting things that we've ever seen, because uh, in Ghostbusters, they have this habit of skirting around definitive answers. Um, no one knows how the proton packs work, and there's like, a whole bunch of other questions about ghosts and other entities, and so let's try to get into some of that. Um, so we have definitive gods. We have, uh, if not separate realms, then a separate realm where there's a supernaturalness. Let's just call it the supernatural realm. And in Ghostbusters, they seem to be indicating that our understanding of the afterlife, or our conceptions of it, are not correct, and that our understanding of it is very, very limited. So I would say that because that's been so consistent, it's gotten to the point where, uh, from like a narrative standpoint, it's not like the absence of that thing seems to be pointing to, hey, this is its own thing. This is chaos. This is the immaterium. This isn't like uh, a mythological kitchen sink where all the other mythologies exist. There isn't a heaven. There isn't a hell. There isn't a Niflheim. There isn't, a Wonderland. There isn't a Narnia. There is the supernatural realm where ectoplasm comes from, and where we are connected in some, like, I don't even know how, because Ghostbusters never answers it. Somehow our souls, which manifest as ghosts, are connected to that other realm. And the only other place that we really see that and see so many things in common is 40K. And so we're starting to see, I think, that these play by a lot of similar rules, but comparatively, this is a version of the Immaterium where no major gods have manifested. Like, Gozer isn't at the level of Nurgle. Gozer can't exert influence without being brought in. There's nowhere that Gozer's influence exists in the material realm before, so, or I guess without somebody bringing her in on our world. Now, that may not be true. I may be assuming something there, but it seems like if Gozer existed already in our material realm, there wouldn't be a need for conditions to be brought together to make it so Gozer could manifest. She could just do it whenever she wanted if she was already here. So that seems to indicate that Gozer exists in the material realm, and although she's a god, and we can get into some of what those powers might be, it's not quite the same power level as either a chaos god or even maybe like a Lovecraftian god. Like, we're sort of, and this is why I brought in D&D, we're sort of at the lower D&D god level. We're actually, we're maybe in like the mid tier here. And so here's where we can get into some of Gozer's powers. So, and this is also why D&D is useful, because, and so here's an interesting topic to me. Is I'm really fascinated by cosmologies and like the universal ways that things move together. Like, hopefully, watching my channel, you can see that I have a fascination with truth and logic and how everything operates by logic, or else it couldn't causally be. It couldn't make enough sense to exist. Therefore, everything has to follow logic. And, so finding those immovable parts of reality that are the same no matter where you are, I think are really cool. And D&D does a lot to really codify how fantasy works. And that's one of the things I think that the 3rd edition and 3.5 contributed a whole lot to fantasy literature and gaming and just imagination in general. A whole lot of our vernacular, I don't think people realize, is based on D&D lore. And our understanding of how things work with magic comes from D&D. And a lot of this is actually, very reasonable. Like, here we go with gods. D&D is also very iffy on the concept, but in order to get kind of a baseline understanding, some of you may be familiar with this if you've ever visited versusbattleswiki.com, checking out everybody's stats and everything. I think gods need a few basic traits, and one of them starts with either existing in an outside realm that isn't causally related to the material realm, and also they need to be immortal, specifically by what in Versus Battles terms is called low godly regeneration, which means they can regenerate from complete bodily destruction. And like if just absolutely nothing of them is left, they can still come back. So you have, and then so with those two things, also sort of comes movement, being able to, um, or sort of assuming the power of being able to get to that realm, or if you manifest there, having the power to traverse outside of it. And this is an important distinction when we go here to the classifications of ghosts, uh, where one of them really closely lines up to kind of lesser warp entities. Like if you think about like, fish or whales in the ocean as opposed to like a sailing vessel of a very intentional chaos space marines versus sort of a more mindless, creature, maybe even a bigger mindless creature like a kraken or something, or like a giant squid or whatever. Um, but a god can travel outside of the realm, whereas one of those lesser entities can't exist outside of that realm. So the immortality and regeneration sort of means or sort of implies a durable physicality, whether it's permeable or non-permeable, whether it's solid or insubstantial. Usually they can move between the two. And I think, also the basic power to interact with the cosmology of the setting. So we're in Ghostbusters setting, or we're in the Ghostbusters setting. In D&D, maybe this would be being able to manipulate souls. If you think of the cosmological cycle, the ecology of D&D, souls are cycled out into the afterlife, and they get involved in the soul trade, and this gets converted back into raw magic through the, I think, elemental planes, and then this feeds back into the material world, and also naturally through the Feywild, I think. And so in Ghostbusters, I think Gozer, we have to assume if she's a god, has the power to manipulate ghosts. And the reason this is so interesting and so important is because now we're getting back to the lead from Afterlife, that it's not quite a throwaway line where Gozer comes back and repeats the question, "Are you a god?" And it was such a weird line in the first movie that, I've never seen very much discussion on this, but this is one of the most important, like, to me, this is what makes Ghostbusters one of the most fascinating supernatural settings, is because Gozer asks, "Are you a god?" And there's no explanation for it. So we have to search, we have to look around and see, wait, why did that happen? And if we understand that Gozer is a god, Gozer can manipulate souls, and if we're assuming here that Gozer came from a separate realm where she has freedom of movement and was summoned into this realm where her powers can manifest, the first question she asks is, "Are you a god?" The answer to this question is quite obviously yes. The Ghostbusters, and this is the whole point of this video right here, okay? This is the whole point. The Ghostbusters don't know it. They didn't dwell on that question. We've gone through four movies, and we're gonna get to Frozen Empire. Okay, uh, we've gone through four movies, and nobody has questioned why Gozer asks, "Are you a god?" If a god is asking that, and uh, oh my gosh, what's his name? Um, Stands, Ray Stans, Egon Spangler, Winston Zedmore. So when Winston says, um, if someone asks if you're a god, you say yes. His instincts are so right. He's just missing one word. It's not someone. It's if a god. If a god asks you, "Are you a god?" then the answer is yes. And here's my speculation. Gozer came into our realm and saw the Ghostbusters. And I think with the events leading up, and the fact that both Zool and Vince Clothor, or Vince, yeah, Vince Clothor, I think that's his name, um, were sort of heralds. They came out and they made way, like they uh, performed the final ritual to summon Gozer, but there was a whole lot leading up to that where the building specifically was meant to channel and build like a battery, like a giant capacitor to build supernatural energy over the years until there was enough to create the breach or to create either a breach into Gozer's realm although I think what's more accurate is a connection specifically like a phone call to Gozer and opening up that phone line through which Zool and Vince could come through because the the bandwidth wasn't enough for Gozer. It couldn't handle Gozer, but it could handle these lesser minions. And so we've got a whole bunch of supernatural energy building. We've got a whole bunch of ghosts that can now manifest. And I'm not sure what the mechanics of that are yet. But the supernatural energy builds and maybe it just makes the connection weaker. So maybe when people or sort of either when people die, they're becoming ghosts more frequently, or the ghosts that are always there have an easier time manifesting. And which also may kind of answer what is the immaterium. It seems to be a mirror of our reality, or perhaps of all realities. Um, however distorted that is. So all of these things are manifesting, and all of these ghosts are popping up. So when Vince and Zool come through, one of my speculations is that they're expecting things to be much worse. Like when you kind of look at how Vince interacts with the horse, he's very sycophantic. And when you look at that kind of behavior, you could say maybe he's disappointed a little bit. Like he comes out and he's looking around and he's like, if we're about to summon Gozer, there should be a lot more ghosts. And so he starts getting a little sycophantic. He starts getting a little preachy, you know? And then he says like, you will all die in flames. And the cabbie's like, yeah, what an asshole. To me, that kind of makes sense, that there's less ghosts than Vince is expecting. He gets a little sycophantic, and then Gozer is actually summoned, and she perhaps puts out her aspects. She searches the landscape. She is able to extend her senses into New York now that she's able to come through the portal. And the first thing she notices is that there is way less supernatural activity than she was expecting. There are way less minions that she has direct control over because she has power over souls, power over ghosts than she was expecting. And I think her powers are also able to perceive, and this may indicate some of how the proton packs work. They may actually, and I I think this is also suggested by what we see in the movie, is that although they don't properly explain it, what we assume is that the Ghostbusters have figured out how to bridge the gap between technology and magic. They're able to both sense magic with their e-reader, or was it EM reader, EMP? No, it's not EMP. It's ecto reader. Well, whatever it is, they have that like e-meter thing. That's what it's called, the e-meter. And so they can somehow perceive supernatural qualities in the environment. And then of course the proton packs can directly interface with ghosts. Like they can actually interact with ghosts. Whatever particle beam they're shooting out, ghosts are trapped by it, like a lasso. And the capture box also is magnetic. It sucks them in like a vortex. So clearly the technology they've designed can interact with supernatural qualities. So it's not too far off to think in like a D&D sense magic sort of way that when Gozer tries to analyze what the Ghostbusters are, check their equipment, are they carrying any magic items? Like, who are these guys? That she can sense they have the power to capture ghosts, and that there are way less ghosts in the environment. Now, the sole purpose of a god, no matter what setting you're in, is to control those separate realms, whether it's their own realm that interfaces with the soul resources of an environment, like D&D gods, or like Kami, or in a 40K sense, where what they control is the materium, or is the immaterium itself. Like, gosh, how do you word that? So the actual entity extends as a non-Euclidean volume of the immaterium. Think of it as a percentage of the immaterium. However much of the immaterium is you, is how much of it you control. And that's what Nurgle is. That's what Tzeentch is. That's what Khorne is. And it's less of a duty connection and more of a ecological connection. The happenings of the material realm create the immaterium. And that's an interesting thought that separates, potentially, Ghostbusters from a setting like D&D, where magic sort of causes reality to happen, whereas in 40K, reality causes magic to happen. And I think Ghostbusters leans a lot more heavily to the 40K side. So I think when Gozer comes through and sees these look like the entities responsible for diminishing my control over New York City, these are the ones who control the souls that I was banking on. They control soul resources, and there's no other entity that controls soul resources than a god. That's what the definition of a god is. So whether that soul resource, again, comes from or is, or perhaps both, that supernatural setting, the god, or the definition, I think, of a god, aside from their attributes, is that those attributes are allowing them to control that power. So Gozer sees the Ghostbusters, and in her mind, they fit the definition of a god. And furthermore, I think she's right. And again, the Ghostbusters don't know it. This is like, if we were to take Ghostbusters and set it in the near future in like a cyberpunk setting, I think this is probably where it would need to go, because or they could finally just realize they have this much potential in the story, and the next Ghostbusters movie, could be these kind of things. But like, the Ghostbusters qualify as gods because not only do they have the ability to identify and capture souls, but they've also, in the D&D sense, have created their own pocket dimension. Or the other explanation could be that they have taken control over a part of the immaterium. They've been able to put it in their holding facility. That's what the holding facility is. It's basically like they've annexed a room in the warp. And so effectively, that makes them gods. They are now, like, if Nurgle is 25 or 24.9 whatever percent of the warp, the Ghostbusters are 0.000 something percent of the warp. There's probably a whole lot more zeros before we get to a decimal, or before we get to a number, but they control a small fractional part of the warp, and they have control over souls. And so by definition, although they don't have the powers, they have the functionality of a god. The only things they're missing really are the additional qualities, the immortality, the control over energy, which to some extent they do have. It's just more mechanical than innate. The immortality, the healing, and which, so here's the movement, which is very interesting. In Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, we see a Ghostbuster become a ghost. And so even closer now to a god, after the line in Ghostbusters Afterlife, ironically enough, the Ghostbusters are even more gods in Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. Although, again, they don't know it, they have the ability now to become ghosts and to go into their own holding facilities. That's one thing they didn't explore because they didn't have time, because as soon as Phoebe becomes a ghost, she lets out Garaka. Spoiler alert, sorry. So they're slowly building these things, and I think the end of Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, where Winston is talking to Janine, kind of like hints at these further possibilities. Like, I think the writers know there's a whole lot more going on in Ghostbusters. They just haven't figured it out yet. And they're like, well, we know there's potential here. We know this setting still has potential. We haven't undermined it yet. With the one exception of the Ghostbusters movie that won't be named, it's funny. It seems like they're hinting towards it. It seems like Winston either openly knows this is the direction they're heading, or he intuits that there's more room for them to explore. Like in the Ghostbusters universe, Egon Spangler in the very beginning with Ray didn't think it was a crazy idea as a scientist to dedicate time and resources to developing the technology to discover and capture ghosts. So we already know that's, I mean, obviously with all the events that played out, we know that's not just possible, it happened in that universe. But before any of that happened, there was already enough out there that Egon didn't think that was like a scientifically irresponsible thing to do, although of course the university disagreed. But he was proven right. And in an engineering sense, Winston may have that instinct. He also knows, Egon believed in this and he was right. And there's a whole lot more we don't know, and there's a whole lot more that we can still figure out. But there's no indication that they fully understand the implications of what they've built. The Ghostbusters don't know they're gods yet. And that's the funny thing. So they have their own pocket dimension that they control, that can hold souls, and that they can expand at need to hold more. They have the ability to traverse to the immaterium and to interact, at least on the material realm, with ghosts through the proton packs. The only things that they would need left then are to make sure that once they go into the immaterium, that they could still interact with ghosts. Although I guess they would be at their same power level. So what I'm saying is, it would be really useful if the Ghostbusters could make ghost versions of the proton packs. If there's something that they could translate, if walking into the immaterium didn't destroy the proton packs, if they could still be used the same way, that, and of course being ghosts, if they could still hold them, either that or creating versions that just existed, like in a separate, like they could have an armory. Like, just because they have a holding facility doesn't mean it has to be filled with ghosts. They could fill it with ghost equipment that they made in there while being ghosts. The question is, where would they get the other materials? Food for thought. So, the last kind of part of this that really fascinates me, and kind of ties back into this, is in Frozen Empire, we also get this whole thing with the Fire Lord guy. And these primitive Ghostbusters who, like D&D characters, have a different approach to dealing with the ghost problem, is they seal them inside objects. And this is obviously a more primitive technology than being able to create like a holding facility for multiple ghosts that you could potentially go into. This is more creating like a binding item. Excuse me. So there's some sort of magic that they can do. They have control over fire, and fire maybe affects ghosts, or they have some addition. They're I think, based on the lore that Patton Oswalt gives in exposition. I forget what the exact details are, but it seems like they have both the control over fire, which can act like a like a proton pack, like their magic fire can hurt ghosts, but additionally they also know the spell to create a holding item for a ghost and then to somehow get them into it. So this magic and this profession in that way existed before that. And that's kind of like, if you were a human, that is exactly how you would go about it. And that puts you at a very specific human power level tier that you can't get out of unless you create that higher bit of technology that gets you into that next ranking that actually has upward mobility. There is no upward mobility in sealing those ghosts unless you then, for example, like I'm kind of thinking like in D&D terms, using those like a battery. Like, I've collected enough souls, now if I have enough magic power, I can use those souls to, create my own godly realm, and this will, connect me with its powers, and I'll, like, if I'm a god in D&D, then I basically exist so long as that realm exists, and there's like a bunch of other like pacts and contracts and things that would be decided, and there's like but like basically in D&D, I think the rule is like, if you can get to the power, nobody's going to stop you from holding it. You're now just responsible for it. Like, once you become a god, no gods are going to say, hey, you can't be a god. They're now just going to say, hey, now you're responsible for coming to our meetings. um so the the Ghostbusters movies have now made a very clear and explicit distinction between, like, this technology exists now in canon, that sort of like in Dragon Ball, where Master Roshi tries to seal Piccolo in the rice cooker. Humans can seal ghosts magically in containment items. And the Ghostbusters have discovered a way to achieve the same, job goals, but with a completely new technology that I'm pretty sure everything points to this, makes them gods. I'm pretty sure the Ghostbusters are gods. And that's the whole point of this rant here, is that this is where Ghostbusters has taken us. And now I think they need to like make good on it. If anybody responsible for writing Ghostbusters watches this, there you go. I've given you a ton of food for thought and a ton of things to go look up. Go look up Sigil in D&D, and the Planescape setting. AJ Pickett and a number of other channels on YouTube have done a whole bunch of D&D cosmology videos, and all the different realms and how they're connected, and how souls work and how gods work, and you can go read all those sources yourself. It's really fun. And there's a whole bunch of sources also on 40K. My God, how many channels are there on YouTube explaining 40K topics? Everyone knows the infamous 40K wikis are just endless. So there's a whole lot out there to cross-reference and look at and wonder about. And maybe I'm completely wrong about all of this. That's the great thing. This isn't an objective video. This is a speculative video. I'm not, I'm taking a break from just in this video, just this one video is just for fun, from formal game discussion, and we're just talking about world building. And I think this is something that is really cool. I might be completely wrong about it. Everything else could have a completely different explanation. Who knows? And this video is so long, I almost want to do a follow-up because there's still so much I haven't talked about. We haven't gotten to the fact that Uh, Ghostbusters, like, first of all, we haven't gotten to the classifications yet. Oh my God. I haven't even talked about the classifications. Ghostbusters still hasn't answered, really, aside from talking about demons and gods, has not answered the kitchen sink question of what other entities exist. And uh, preface or hook for part two is we're gonna use the vampire test. If you don't know, this is a world building tool, the vampire litmus test, and uh, this is the difference between Anne Rice and I don't know what's a good comparison. D&D, I guess. Yeah, Anne Rice and D&D. There's a good comparison. One that is magic, and one that is based on possession, which is still magic, but like different qualities. Um, we'll talk about that more in part two. So, uh, what other monsters exist? Do other monsters like where do werewolves fit in Ghostbusters? Where do vampires fit in? What it the Feywild, Fey. What other like you said we know magic exists. That is canon. It is definitive. Magic is a thing. Ghostbusters now needs to answer those further questions because it begs so many of them about what other things exist. I feel like you can't just say magic exists and then not have anything else but ghosts. That's kind of weird. Um, or to not explain the absence of anything else. So I've been talking for so long. That's where we're going to cut it off. This is part one. I know I said this is going to be one video, but two parts for one video. So next time we're going to cover some other topics. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. I don't know. But see you in the next one. See you in part two.